Napoleon's campaign in Syria. The Napoleonic campaign in Syria was an expedition organized and carried out by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799 against the forces of the Ottoman Empire. That they were organizing with the intention of liberating Egypt from French occupation. The campaign turned out to be a failure, as its main objective, which was, to create conditions to proceed to India, was not achieved. The campaign to India was interrupted due to a counteroffensive launched in Egypt by the Ottoman Empire, with British support. Days before Napoleon leaves for Syria. Egypt was practically controlled by the French, but the situation was not secure because, in addition to the holy war proclaimed by the Sultan, two other events constituted serious obstacles to Napoleon's plans: the destruction of an important part of the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile and the news that an army was being prepared in Syria to invade Egypt and expel the French. This army was being organized by Ahmed al-Jazir, the Turkish governor of Syria. In order for Napoleon to go ahead with his plans and advance towards India, it was necessary to destroy that Turkish army and try to get the support of some peoples in the Syrian region. As British naval dominance would not allow for much, or perhaps any, support from France. At that time, Syria was a region of the Ottoman Empire. Divided into 5 pashaliks, administrative divisions ruled by a pasha: Aleppo, Damascus, Tripoli, Acre and Jerusalem. The region is not as deserted as Egypt, except for the delta and an important part of the banks of the Nile, but the marches were especially difficult, given the sandy nature of the terrain and a certain scarcity of water. Temperatures are usually high in summer, but in winter they can be surprisingly low, especially in the higher areas. Napoleon set out for the Syrian expedition with 4 infantry divisions and a body of cavalry troops. He carried field artillery with him, but not the much heavier siege artillery. The latter was sent by sea from the port of Damietta, but, upon reaching his destination, before disembarking, he was captured by the British. The 4 infantry divisions were commanded by Jean-Baptiste Kleber, Louis-André Bon, Jean Lannes, Jean Reynier and the cavalry commanded by Joachim Murat. In total they numbered 13,000 men and 52 artillery guns. Louis-Alexandre Berthier, the chief of staff of Napoleon's army, accompanied the expeditionary force to Syria. Contrary to what had happened at the beginning of the Egyptian campaign, the French troops were now better equipped and adapted to the desert environment. Most already had canteens for individual water transport and wore cotton uniforms. However, in the winter months, Palestine can experience very cold days and the troops also suffered from this. The forces of the Ottoman Empire. The forces that opposed Napoleon are made up of troops from different backgrounds, but above all by Turks and Mamluks. They were adapted to the theater of operations. They often proved to be worthy fighters but lacked the discipline and organizational skills of the French troops. In addition to the infantry, these troops always had a large number of cavalry, which gave them great mobility. The army that the Ottoman Empire prepared to face the French was under the command of the Turkish governor of Syria, Ahmed al-Jazir. It is difficult to know the total number of his troops, who were scattered in several forts, but, in addition to this army, another intervened, sent by the Pasha of Damascus. The march to Syria. Napoleon left Cairo on February 10, 1799, and began the march to Syria. After 120 kilometers of march, the army reached Salahiyah, at the eastern end of the Nile Delta, where the desert begins. Napoleon arrived at Alarix on February 17. With his field artillery, he subjected the Jazir forces who had dug in the houses, outside the walls, under cover of the fortress artillery, to a heavy bombardment. After the first battles, in which the French took about 500 prisoners, most of the troops took refuge in the fortress and the cavalry gathered about 2 kilometers away. On February 20, the fort's garrison, consisting of 900 Turks and Mamluks, surrendered to the French, although they lost about 400 men in the attack on the fort. Most of the Turkish garrison was released with the word not to fight the French for a year. The march continued and Gaza was occupied on the 24th, without offering resistance. The same did not happen in Jaffa, whose garrison consisted of Jazir's troops. The population of Syria was predominantly Arab, but the garrisons in the fortresses were Turkish. On March 7, after 3 days of fighting and after French sappers breached the city walls, Jaffa was stormed and sacked. However, around 2,500 Turks took refuge in the citadel, which was not conquered until the next day. Between 2,000 and 2,500 Turks were captured, many of whom had been freed by word of mouth at El Arish. 400,000 servings of biscuits and 100 tons of rice were found. At that time, Napoleon already had fewer than 13,000 men. On the one hand, there were casualties in the fighting and, on the other hand, part of the troops became ill, many due to fatigue, lack of water and poor nutrition, but other more worrying signs also began to appear, the bubonic plague. On average, 30 soldiers died a day. Plague cases had already been reported in Alexandria in December 1798. Cases had also been recorded in Abukir. These facts did not prevent Napoleon from going ahead with his plans. Napoleon could not have troops to protect the prisoners or escort them to Egypt. If he freed them, they would surely fight the French again somewhere down the line, or attack the columns as soon as they resumed their march. Considering the size of the force, he had to choose between killing the prisoners or aborting the expedition. Napoleon had the prisoners executed, without any problem of conscience, because the Turks also tortured the French prisoners to death. 800 prisoners were bayoneted on the 8th of March, 600 on the 9th and 1041 on the 10th. Napoleon adopted the morale of his enemy. On March 17, 1799, Napoleon reached Haifa, almost 500 kilometers inside Syria, and laid siege to Acre. Although the fortress of Joao de Acre was old, before the Crusades, it had been fortified by the Knights Hospitaller. Its walls, despite being poorly treated, were thick and resistant to field artillery. They were reinforced by several towers and a castle inside, and defended by 250 artillery muzzles. Its geographical position, on a rocky peninsula, made it practically impregnable. Napoleon established his headquarters on Mount Carmel, from where he could look north towards the fortress of Acre over the bay. Given the circumstances, he began the siege without heavy artillery. Despite this handicap, he attacked the fortress walls. The first assault was launched on March 28, but was unsuccessful. Another assault, launched on April 1, was also unsuccessful and the French suffered heavy casualties. On April 16, Kleber, with a detachment of 2,000 men, was attacked on Mount Tabor, in the Jezreel Valley, southeast of Acre. The French held out for 10 hours, until they almost ran out of ammunition. When it was anticipated that they could no longer hold the defense, Napoleon arrived with General Bond's division and forced the Turks to withdraw. Over the next 3 weeks, the French launched repeated attacks on the Acre fortress, with heavy casualties, but were in place on May 10. Back to Egypt. In mid-May, Napoleon learned that Sir Sidney Smith was sending a Turkish army to Egypt. He immediately lifted the siege of the Acre, and on May 20 he marched back to Cairo. Before beginning the withdrawal, on the 16th, he gave orders, which were not obeyed, to his chief physician, René Nicolas de Friche d'Eschenets, to administer a lethal dose of opium to plague patients, in order to spare them torture. Of the Turks. After the withdrawal of Napoleon's army, the Turks massacred the sick and wounded who remained in the Stella Maris monastery. The French army arrived in Cairo on June 14. It was a demoralized troop body on the verge of mutiny. Of the 13,000 men who made up the force at the start of the campaign, 2,500 had died and another 2,500 were sick. Of the latter, half did not reach Egypt. This video is just a summary, and of course many things were left out. Don't forget to like and share the video, subscribe to our channel, and see you next time.